Okay, welcome back, committee. Committee will now receive presentation from Pauline de Jong, Executive Director of the Office of the Regulator of Oil and Gas Operations. Before I begin, I will ask members and staff in the room to introduce themselves, starting with on my left.
Mr. Chair, Steve Norn, MLA for Trinidad Willida.
Katrina Knockleby, MLA for Great Slave.
Kevin O'Reilly, Frame Lake.
Caitlin Cleveland, Cam Lake.
Online? Anybody online?
Ryland Johnson.
Yeah, Jackie Jacobson, Emily Nunakput.
Okay, that was Ryland Johnson.
Yellowknife North. Thanks, Ron.
Okay, you got it there. The staff?
James Thomas, Committee Clerk.
Amy Lazat, Sketty Advisor.
Merci for the introductions. Today's meeting is being live streamed on the Assembly's social media channels, and any presentation materials will be uploaded to the Legislative Assembly's website. I would like to remind all members and our witnesses that all comments, questions, or remarks will need to be directed to myself as the chair. Both members and the witnesses will need to wait to be recognized by the chair before speaking. I will now invite our first presenter, Ms. de Jong, to introduce herself and if there's any available staff, and to proceed with her opening remarks or her presentation. Thank you. Ms. de Jong.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you for the opportunity to give this presentation today. My name is Pauline de Jong, and I'm the Executive Director of the Office of the Regulator of Oil and Gas Operations, or OROGO. The presentation is going to start with a brief review of our mandate and our roles, and then I'm going to go on and talk a little bit about our recent activities and some of our anticipated activities for the rest of this year. And I look forward to answering any questions that you might have at the end of the presentation. Could we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So OROGO was established with devolution on April 1st, 2014, and I was designated as the regulator by the Commissioner and Executive Council on August 2nd, 2020. Most of our work is carried out under the Oil and Gas Operations Act. We do some work under the Petroleum Resources Act, and we are also considered to be a regulatory authority under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, which also comes with some responsibilities. We are housed for administrative purposes in the Department of Justice. Most of our interaction with the department is around things like corporate functions, IT, finance, those sorts of issues. The department has no involvement in the regulatory decision-making process. Next slide, please. So our mandate is established in the Oil and Gas Operations Act, and it is primarily to ensure human safety, protect the environment, and conserve oil and gas resources in the sense of not wasting them. The changes that happened to OGOA earlier this year in July 2020 did not affect our mandate, and it is important to note that we do not have a mandate to promote development. Next slide, please. So this slide just shows you our strategic plan. I realize that it's probably very, very small on the screen and you might not be able to read it very well. Our mission is to regulate oil and gas activities to keep people safe and protect the environment where we live and work. And we support that mission with 4 strategic objectives. The first being to enhance certainty and predictability in our actions and in regulatory decisions. The next one is to promote accessibility and transparency in our work, to build and maintain resilient working relationships, and finally, to grow oil and gas regulatory capacity in the Northwest Territories. Next slide, please. So it's another small picture that shows you where our jurisdiction is. Our jurisdiction consists of the onshore Northwest Territories, with the exception of the Inuvialuit Settlement Region, retained federal lands, and transboundary pipelines. So from the retained federal lands perspective, the largest or most significant one of these from an oil and gas perspective is the Norman Wells Proven area. That area remains regulated by the Canada Energy Regulator, which used to be called the National Energy Board. Similarly, the ISR is also regulated by the Canada Energy Regulator, and the Canada Energy Regulator continues to regulate transboundary pipelines. You'll see when you look at the picture that our jurisdiction largely is similar to that of the Mackenzie Valley under the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act. Next slide, please. So this slide just goes in a little bit more detail on our core responsibilities under the different pieces of legislation. So under the Oil and Gas Operations Act, we issue operations authorizations and well approvals. We do this for exploration and drilling activities, production activities, seismic activities, and also for the suspension and abandonment or decommissioning of any wells or other oil and gas infrastructure. We conduct inspections, we do incident response, and we issue guidelines and interpretation notes to clarify the regulator's perception of the Act. I should take an opportunity just to clarify the word abandonment, because I know it presents some challenges. In the oil and gas activity, abandonment means, in the oil and gas industry, abandonment means the permanent plugging, cutting, and capping of a well. So it's not a bad thing. It's a natural end to the life cycle of the well, and it's generally an important step towards overall reclamation of the well site. Under the Petroleum Resources Act, the regulator issues significant discovery and commercial discovery declarations. And under the MVRMA, as a regulatory authority, the regulator is responsible to conduct preliminary screenings for operations authorization applications, and also to look at land use plan conformity for any activities that come to us for approval. Next slide, please. So Orogo has service agreements in place with the Alberta Energy Regulator and the Canada Energy Regulator. We do this because our size and the current level of activity means that it's not practical for us to have all of the different types of technical expertise available to us in-house. The service agreements are only for technical advice and support. And we also have other contracts in place, as and when contracts and standing offer agreements, for situations where our service agreement partners are not able to provide the expertise that we need. Next slide, please. So this is the last slide in the presentation giving the overview of our role and responsibilities. And I just wanted to take this time to kind of situate what Orogo does in the context of overall oil and gas resource management, because as you can see, we're only a little piece of that puzzle. The first component is going to be the land use plans, because these identify where oil and gas activities may occur and set conditions for those oil and gas activities. The next piece over on your right-hand side is the exploration and production licenses, which are issued by the Department of Industry, Tourism and Investment. And these are the licenses that give the company in question the access to the resource in a particular area. Next, going clockwise along, you see the land use permit and the water license, obviously issued by the Land and Water Boards of the Mackenzie Valley. And these are usually needed by operators in order to actually access the site. So land use permits and water licenses would cover roads and ice bridges. They cover camps for housing of workers, and they cover disposal of waste. And then finally, you get around to the left-hand side of the diagram where you'll see the operations authorizations that we issue, which are for the very specific activity that's being carried out in relation to that well or piece of oil and gas infrastructure. So can we move to the next slide, please? Excellent. So now we're going to move to a little bit of an overview of what Orogo has been doing recently and also what we anticipate as future possible activities. So last year in 2019-2020, there was less activity than there had been the year before, but still some movement towards dealing with the requirements of the well suspension and abandonment guidelines. So we saw 2 well abandonments in the Dehcho region, 3 well suspensions in the South Slave region, and all of the operator-led suspended well inspections that are required under our guidelines and under the regulations. Based on the applications that we've received so far, we anticipate in the coming winter work season, which is essentially January to March 2021, that there would be 15 well abandonments in the Dehcho region and 12 well abandonments in the Sahtu region, as well as those ongoing operator-led inspections. However, it is important to note that the crews that carry out the activities in those areas come to the Northwest Territories from other jurisdictions. So primarily they come from Alberta and British Columbia. And that means that the Chief Public Health Officer needs to approve their entry into the Northwest Territories to carry out this work. So the companies in question are waiting for the Chief Public Health Officer's decision as to whether or not that's going to be okay. If the decision is that no, these operators cannot enter the territory, then this work will be delayed to the 2022 winter work season. Can I have the next slide, please? So in terms of inspections and incidents, in 2019-2020, we conducted 5 on-site inspections in the Dehcho and the South Slave regions and in Inuvik. We looked at 15 different suspended well sites, as well as a shut-in production facility and an associated gathering system of pipelines. We also reviewed all of the operator-led suspended well inspection reports and reviewed the annual operations reports and annual environmental and safety reports. I should point out that we do our best every year to inspect every activity that we do authorize. So in terms of incidents in 2019-2020, we received reports of 4 incidents and 2 near misses. And reporting of near misses is also required under our legislation. And we respond to incidents both administratively in terms of reviewing and receiving reports and on-site in terms of inspection activities. When we receive a report of an incident, we prepare an incident summary report, which is posted as soon as we can onto our public registry and is regularly updated as the incident evolved and is eventually, hopefully, closed off. Thanks. So moving on to suspended well status, this is a slide that just shows you how the overall, portfolio of suspended wells has been changing since we brought the well suspension and abandonment guidelines into effect in 2017. So you will see that the blue bar, which is the number of compliant suspended wells, so that's compliant with the requirements of the guidelines, has increased quite steadily, and that the red bar, which is the number of non-compliant wells, is also decreasing quite steadily. You'll also note that the overall number of suspended wells is also decreasing as those well abandonments take place. So the work that is currently anticipated for the 2021 winter work season would address most of those remaining non-compliant suspended wells. The wells that are compliant and suspended, so that's the blue bar, most of them are due to be abandoned by January 31st of 2023, unless they are brought back into production. So we move on to guidelines and interpretation notes. This is one of the tools that Arogo has to meet our objective of enhancing clarity and certainty and predictability in our work and to promote transparency about how we make our decisions. So to date in 2020-21, we have issued 3 guidelines: public access to information guidelines and interpretation notes, public hearing guidelines and interpretation notes, and revised document submission guidelines and interpretation notes. The first 2 of those came directly out of the changes to OGOA, which came into effect in July. And the third one there was a revised version of the guidelines to allow for electronic only document submission to our office. I think also everyone on the committee is aware that we have 3 other guidelines in development, which are to be finalized by the end of the fiscal year. So that's guidelines for applications for well suspension or abandonment, contingency plan guidelines and interpretation notes, and proof of financial responsibility guidelines and interpretation notes. And I would like to take this opportunity to just thank the committee for the feedback that we've been receiving from you on the guidelines that we have put out for public engagement and consultation. It's been very much appreciated. So Orogo has an information office, and the information office is very much focused on improving accessibility to historical well and seismic information for the public. So one thing that we have been able to achieve since devolution is the digitization of all of these files. So they used to be really available only in paper or in microfiche. Now they're all available electronically, which makes sharing the information with other people much easier. So from April to November of this year, we shared just over 1,500 well history files and 13 seismic files. And we also responded to 68 public inquiries. We have a service standard for responding to public inquiries, which is that we want to respond to 95% of them within 24 hours. And we have been able to meet that service standard target to date. Should also point out that the information office is the contact point for approvals to access core samples from the core library, which is in Calgary. And the manager of the information office is currently working with the Geological Survey of Canada at that core library to ensure continued access to core samples while the building itself is somewhat restricted due to COVID. Moving on to the public registry, one of the changes to OGOA in July 2020 that was very significant was the change to how we deal with information and confidentiality of information. And essentially the new OGOA means that a great deal more information now is public than ever was before. So we have improved our public registry because we knew that we needed an opportunity to share that information more easily with people who are interested. On our public registry, we're currently posting applications, information requests and responses, decisions, reports, and other documents that are related to the applications. If there's other information that people are interested in that's not actually on the public registry, it can be obtained by contacting the information office. So our public registry was developed in partnership with the Land and Water Boards of the Mackenzie Valley. And the intention there was to have it be a similar interface, a same platform. Hopefully that makes it easier for people to use. And it means that they can go back and forth to the different regulators and understand the full regulatory picture for the development in question. So moving on to the next slide. And this is the final slide of the presentation. These are some of the other things that we have been working on over the year and continue to work on. So the Well Watch program is really an opportunity for communities to work with us to address any concerns that they may have about historical well sites in their area. So communities alert us if they have any concerns about abandoned wells, and we would work with the communities to share information and, if necessary, go out and look at the well and find a way forward to address any concerns. We also continue to participate in conferences and trade shows. It looks a little different now, but we keep doing it. And the latest conference that we participated in was the Geoscience Symposium, so you'd be able to see our presentation on that website. One of our strategic objectives is building and maintaining strong working relationships. And in terms of maintaining our relationships with other regulators, we are a member of several groups. We're a member of the Northwest Territories Board Forum. We're also a member of the Western Regulators Forum. We also have a memoranda of understanding with a number of different regulators, including the Canada Energy Regulator and the Workers' Safety and Compensation Commission. Finally, building oil and gas regulatory capacity, another one of our strategic objectives. This doesn't just mean building our own capacity. We try to build capacity with other regulators and other government departments as well. So most recently, we facilitated the delivery of an H2S Alive training here in Yellowknife. So H2S Alive is a training that you need to have in order to be able to access well sites for activities such as inspections. So doing it locally obviously is very helpful, as particularly at this time because of the issues around traveling down to Alberta to do the training. So over 3 days, we were able to offer the training to 10 employees from different GNWT departments and 2 employees from Land and Water Boards, along with 5 members of the Arogo team who also took the training. So I'm going to stop there. There is a final slide, but it really just has our contact information if you would like to come and see us. And just wait for the committee's questions.
Merci, Ms. de Jong. I'll now open the floor for any questions, comments from committee members. Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the presentation, and that's really interesting to hear about the H2S Alive training. I've taken that before, but I did not like the masks on my face, so I pity those of you having to do it. I wanted to come back to the non-compliant wells that you discussed. So you'd mentioned that some are non-compliant currently, and then that there's a potential that this is going to be delayed due to COVID if the CPHO doesn't approve those plans. Can you speak to any liability or risk, environmentally or otherwise, that might be as a result if we don't get to this work this year? Thank you.
I see Ms. Knockleby. Ms. de Jong.
Thank you. Yes, so some of those wells are non-compliant with our guidelines or our regulations. At the moment, though, I can confirm that none of them are leaking or releasing any kind of contaminants into the atmosphere. One thing that we will be needing to do if in fact the work is delayed is working with those operators to provide direction on monitoring that will have to happen to those wells in the interim period, and some kind of notification for if there does come to be a concern so that we can act on it right away.
I see Ms. de Jong. Follow-up, Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you. I'm glad to hear none of them are leaking. So if it is delayed and we have to look within the within the Northwest Territories to monitor those wells, who's going to pay for that? And yeah, I'll leave it there. Who's going to pay for that, do you think?
I see Ms. Knockleby. Ms. de Jong.
I should clarify, actually, the monitoring would be carried out by the operators themselves. So since the restrictions on travel came into place, operators have received approval to come into the Northwest Territories and conduct monitoring activities. They normally do this on a very quick turnaround kind of a basis by helicopter. Usually out of northern BC, sometimes Fort Nelson. So that means that they're able to come in, go directly to the well site, carry out the monitoring, and fly back to the other jurisdiction without running the risk of coming into any contact with Northwest Territories residents. So our experience is that over the past several months, the Office of the Chief Public Health Officer has approved those kinds of activities. So when we're speaking about monitoring, we're expecting that monitoring would be carried out by the operator.
I see Ms. de Jong. Any further questions, Ms. Knockleby?
So just to make sure I understand then, so the monitoring has been all in approved, it's just the ongoing remediation type or work to bring into compliance that would be delayed. But I do have a little bit of...
Ms. Knockleby, Ms. de Jong.
Correct. It is the ongoing, it's the abandonment work that we are waiting to hear whether the Chief Public Health Officer will approve or not.
I see Ms. de Jong and Ms. Knockleby.
my last question. So I'm just curious to know, I know that other departments, when helping, have helped facilitate industry in setting up those isolation plans and working through a lot of the sort of information that's out there on how to do so. I'm just curious to know if you could speak a little bit about how much your office is providing that type of information and help to business to navigate our systems. Thank you.
I see Ms. Knockleby. Mr. Young?
So early on in the summer, we did hold a webinar for our operators who were going to have to come into the territory to do the kind of monitoring activity that we described. And that webinar we co-hosted with the Worker Safety and Compensation Commission, who were able to help out with that and provide information. Other than that, the operators have been working directly with Protect NWT to get the information that they need. We did send out letters to them explaining where they could find the necessary information, and in particular, the order of the Chief Public Health Officer that has to do specifically with mining and oil and gas activities.
I see Mr. Young. Mr. Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Mr. Young, for presenting today. Generally, whenever I speak to both operators and other boards who have to deal with the Rogo, I have nothing but good things to say. So I'd just like to thank you and the staff for all the work you do. I was hoping if we could get an update on the Cameron Hill site that's in receivership, specifically speaking to how much security is remaining in that situation and whether we have a cost estimate of what remediation will look like. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. Johnson. Mr. Young, I'm not certain if you picked up on his comments, because Rylan, you were breaking up considerably. Mr. Young, did you understand, or should he repeat himself?
I think I understood the gist that the interest was in the status of the Cameron Hills field, and in particular in the proof of financial responsibility that's held by the regulator. And then I think at the end, a question about overall remediation costs. I'm seeing nodding, so I'm going to proceed with that. So the Cameron Hills field at the moment is fully compliant with our guidelines and with the regulations. So in that stage, everything is where it should be. The next activity that is scheduled in Cameron Hills in terms of the guidelines is the abandonment of 24 suspended wells, which is due by January 31st, 2023. So activity-wise, that's where we are with Cameron Hills. We did conduct an inspection of the site in September, and there were no major issues or concerns identified by our inspection team when they were out there. In terms of the proof of financial responsibility, Orogo holds $1 million in an irrevocable letter of credit as proof of financial responsibility for Cameron Hills. It's a little bit different than the security that is held by the GNWT through the Land and Water Board process, because proof of financial responsibility can only be used in circumstances associated with spills or debris that's not cleaned up by the operator. But we hold $1 million, and as of yet, we have not dispersed anything from that $1 million. So with the final question being about the reclamation costs, I really can't speak to what the cost of reclamation would be, because that's not something that Orogo regulates. So that is something that would have to be perhaps addressed to the Land and Water Board or to one of the other GNWT departments.
I see Mr. Young. Follow up, Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. Can I just confirm that my audio is coming through now?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, thank you. My other question was into the seismic files you had. I wasn't actually aware that we had any of those active right now. Can I just get a bit more detail on that, whether they're on land or marine? Yeah, and what's going on in the Northwest Territories present. Thank you.
I see Mr. Johnson. You kind of broke up towards the end, but I think Ms. De Jong may have got the gist of your question dealing with seismic files. Ms. De Jong?
Thank you. There are actually no active seismic programs going on in the Northwest Territories in our jurisdiction at this point in time, and there have not been since devolution in 2014. The seismic files that we hold are historical records from seismic activities that were carried out in the past. These reports were stored on microfiche before, so now we have digitized them and can make them available electronically.
Merci, Ms. De Jong. Follow-up, Mr. Johnson?
No further questions. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Yeah, I want to start by saying I've been over to the Orogo office a few times, chatting with folks there, and I too agree that they do a good job. So a number of the areas I are going to ask some questions about, we've probably already chatted about before, but just want to raise them again, I guess for the benefit of the public and perhaps some of the my fellow committee members. Let's start maybe with land use plan conformity. And I did call up the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act, and I see that the land use planning boards are actually supposed to look at the issue of conformity, but I guess when they're asked to. So what role does Orogo play in reviewing? I guess this hasn't really happened yet because there's not a lot of activity going on, but how will Orogo determine conformity with the land use plan that's been approved, say the Sawtooth land use plan or the Gwich'in land use plan? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. De Jong?
Thank you. So what we do is in areas where there is a land use plan, we would look at the activity that is being applied for to us, and we would look at the land use plan and check to see that the activity is in a place in the land use plan where it's allowed to take place. Is essentially the basics of it. To date, we haven't had any situations where that was in question, so we haven't had to refer anything to the land use planning board. By the time it gets to us, usually those kinds of issues have already been addressed.
Merci, Ms. De Jong. Follow-up, Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks. Yeah, I imagine that conformity would probably get triggered by things like land use permit application or water license application, or I don't even know whether an exploration license would application would trigger a land use plan conformity review. That's kind of at the rights issuance stage. I think that's probably the right place to capture it, and that's not something I know that you folks do. So well, let's just talk a little bit about the level of activity then that you folks have had to regulate over the years. You know, I saw the chart where the number of suspended wells that are non-compliant is going down. There's no active exploration. There's actually, I don't think, any active production on any of the lands covered by Orogo. And I know that for the first well, a lot of work was put into development of policies and getting the office set up and so on. Because there's no active exploration, no active production, how's the level of work looking into the future? And I'm sorry, I'm not very optimistic that it's actually going to uptick ever, but that's a different story. So thanks.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. De Jong?
Well, at the moment, we are primarily occupied with the abandonment of these long-term suspended wells. And that has been our focus. You are correct that there have not been any applications for exploration activities or drilling activities since Orogo was established in 2014. So we have 89 suspended wells. And out of those, 69 are on schedule to be abandoned by that January 31st, 2023 deadline. So that means that there is a winter work season in 2021, in 2022, and part of a season in 2023 for those wells to be abandoned if they're not brought back into production. There's then a second group of 20 wells which are scheduled for abandonment by 2025 or 2026. But other than that, that is the full scope of the abandoned wells, the suspended wells that still need to be abandoned.
Merci, Ms. De Jong. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. No, and thanks for that. Yeah, I can see where there's going to be quite a bit of work then involved in shutting or properly abandoning these wells. But after that, unless there's an uptick in exploration, I think we're going to have to, I think we may need to look at rationalizing the level of resources at some point. Is that something that Orogo is starting to think about itself? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. De Jong.
Yes. So we started an internal process of looking at resourcing over the summer in relation to commitments that were made in February, I believe. And now we are in the process of finalizing a request for proposals document to go out and get a third party to review Orogo's resourcing requirements in relation to the expected levels of activity going forward. So hopefully that will be finalized and out in the near future, and we can start working on that.
Merci, Ms. De Jong. Mr. O'Reilly.
Great, no, thanks. And it's not really a terribly comfortable conversation, but I do appreciate the work that's being done. And as I said, I think Orogo's doing a good job in the areas that it does regulate. So maybe I could just ask a couple of questions about suspensions and abandonment. And for all of those wells so we don't actually have any orphan wells in the Northwest Territories, am I correct in that? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. De Jong.
That is correct. There are no orphaned wells in Orogo's jurisdiction. All of the suspended wells that we have owners, companies that are responsible for carrying out their eventual abandonment.
Merci, Ms. De Jong. Mr. O'Reilly.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. That's good news. But I think we're going to end up with some orphan wells in a few months with Strategic Oil and Gas now in bankruptcy, not just receivership, but bankruptcy. So those are going to head to GNWT for remediation. But what sort of, and this is probably not necessarily just a question for Orogo, but I don't think our legislation makes any provision for say operators to pay into a fund that will look after orphan wells. Like I think in Alberta, there is a system of doing that after they've got, probably thousands of abandoned and orphan wells in Alberta. Our legislation, though, makes no provision for that. So maybe I could just get you to talk a little bit about that. And the Well Watch program, I guess, is one way to try to keep a watch on these things, but that's using public funding. So should we start to look at opportunities for industry to fund some of these activities rather than public funds? Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. De Jong.
So I can confirm that there is no orphaned well program in the Northwest Territories, and that is something that is not allowed for in our legislation. At the moment, of course, because we have no orphaned wells, that does mean that all of these approved well abandonments that we're anticipating would be paid for by the companies that own the well. In terms of the Well Watch program, the focus is more on historical abandoned wells and other abandoned oil and gas infrastructure, so not so much on suspended wells that still have owners. So with the Well Watch program, our process is, if we do determine that there is a concern about the well, our process is first to try to identify the company that was responsible for the well when it was abandoned or any successor company, and communicate with them. And if that's not successful, then we do ask the GNWT to look after the file.
Merci, Ms. Young. If you have any more questions, Mr. O'Reilly, I'll put you back on the list. Mr. Norton.
Yep, let's see, Mr. Chair. I'm just looking at the online public registry, and I did have a couple of questions, because I'm not too terribly familiar with Rogo, but I understand kind of like the high-level stuff, that work that you do. But just looking at the activities here, with some, like, there's like 46 wells here. There's one here, it says alter condition of well. It's the acronym's ACW. There's operations OA. And then there's something grayed out is significant discovered declaration SDD. So the first two are kind of like, I just want to make sure I understand a little bit what each those activities are. Like, what can you just tell the committee and just maybe educate me on what that is exactly, and specifically what the alter condition of a well. Thank you.
I see Mr. Norton, Mr. Young.
Thank you. So we issue two different levels of approvals. The larger umbrella approval is the operations authorization. So the operations authorization is when we are looking at the company's management systems, their environmental protection plan, their safety plan, their emergency response plans. An operations authorization can be issued to cover activities on a number of different wells. So say a company had 5 wells in a particular area, they wanted to abandon all 5 wells, they would only apply to us for one operations authorization to cover off the abandonment of all of those 5 wells. However, each individual well would then require what we call a well approval, which is subsidiary to the operations authorization. And the well approval application really talks about the very technical plan for carrying out the work with the well. So, what kinds of plugs are they going to use? What kind of cementing are they going to do? Those kinds of issues. So where you see operations authorization, that is that more general umbrella activity. When you see alter the condition of a well, that is one type of well approval. You can have approvals to drill a well, approvals to complete a well, and then approvals to alter the condition of a well, which generally covers suspension and abandonment of the well. So that's the distinction between those two types of approvals.
I see Mr. Young. Follow up, Mr. Norton.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, and thank you for that response. It was informative. So just going back here, there's also the Significant Discovery Declaration, SDD. When was the last time that was used, and actually what exactly is that mean? Thank you.
I see Mr. Norton, Mr. Young.
So a significant discovery declaration is something that the regulator issues under the Petroleum Resources Act. So it's not under the Oil and Gas Operations Act. And essentially, it is an acknowledgement that an operator drilled an exploratory well and found a level of resource that meets the definition for a significant discovery in the Petroleum Resources Act. So since I guess I should say that once the regulator issues a significant discovery declaration, the company can then take that declaration and go to Industry, Tourism and Investment and request a significant discovery license on the basis of that declaration. So that's where the declaration fits in that process. We've had 2 significant discovery processes since devolution, and I believe that the last one ended in 2016.
I see Mr. Young. Ms. Knockleby.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, I wanted to come back to the core sample program or core sample requirement that Ms. de Jong mentioned. I know that with all of our orphan sites across the Northwest Territories, is this just, do you have any that are abandoned as far as the oil and gas system goes, in the same way that we see abandoned core samples with the mining and mineral sides of things? I know we've had that happen and we've lost a lot of information that way. So I'm just wondering if that sort of problem occurs in oil and gas as well. Thank you.
Merci, Ms. Knockleby. Ms. de Jong?
The core samples that are gathered during the drilling process are actually sent down to the Geological Survey of Canada core sample operation in Calgary. They have a large building where they keep all of these for us. And so although at Orogo we would approve a request to access a core sample, the actual accessing of that core sample would happen in Calgary.
Merci, Ms. de Jong. Ms. Knockleby?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yeah. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I always found it rather curious that Orogo, as a regulator, was tasked with having to house this geoscience data and information. I don't know why that, to me, it just seems to make more sense to have all of that with the NWT Geological Survey, and where all the mining stuff is and mineral data is kept. I don't know why the seismic and all the core data and all that is managed by those guys as well. It just seems like a very odd mix to have that lumped in with Orogo's regulatory function. I think that's probably just an artifact of what we inherited from the feds, but is that, I don't know, I guess I should really be asking this question of the minister, but is this something that you've thought about, or that Orogo has any considered? Thanks. I'll leave it at that. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Let's see, Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. de Jong?
Thank you. We have not actively talked about moving the core facility. To the best of my knowledge, that's not something that has been discussed. We can report that the service and support that we receive from the Geological Survey of Canada in Calgary is very good. We have a very good working relationship there, and they're very helpful. So we have no concerns about the current arrangement.
Let's see, Ms. de Jong. Mr. O'Reilly?
Thanks, consummate diplomat there. Thank you. I know I appreciate the answer. I do really need to ask that question of the minister, and I did try to raise it during the review of the bills in the last assembly, but the scope of the issues that the minister was prepared to consider, really, this didn't fit in there. So when we finally get to it, I'll still be around to ask these kinds of questions. But I have another question about, you have these service agreements with the Alberta Energy Regulator, the new name for the National Energy Board, the Canada Energy Regulator. How often do these service agreements ever, I think they're probably some kind of standing offer arrangement where you guys can contract them to give you some expert advice when you need it. But how often do you actually draw on those services? And can you just maybe give me a few examples of where you've used that arrangement? And look, I think it's probably the best that we can do in terms of, we can't have all of that expertise in-house ourselves, but just kind of curious how and when you use it and for what. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
I see Mr. O'Reilly. Ms. de Jong?
Thank you. So the service agreements do function essentially as a kind of an as and when contract. We don't have any obligations to use a certain number of hours a year or anything like that. It's strictly as we need it. Our use of the service agreement with the Canada Energy Regulator has declined quite steadily over time as Orogo has kind of found its feet and we've been able to do more things in-house. So I would say that right now the use of that service agreement is fairly minimal. We do see more routine use of the service agreement with the Alberta Energy Regulator, and that's because we use the service agreement to access their engineers and experts in drilling and in particularly at this point in well suspension and abandonment activities. So on that note, I would say that really every time we receive an application to carry out a suspension or an abandonment, so this would be at the well approval level because it's the technical level, we would be requesting support from the Alberta Energy Regulator to review that application.
I see Mr. Young. Mr. O'Reilly. Question.
I'd be pleased to know, Mr. Chair, that I don't actually have any more. But I do want to thank Orogo for the work that you guys do. And I know that I can go over and talk to you anytime I've got any questions as well. And so, again, thanks very much for appearing today and answering the questions. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Merci, Mr. O'Reilly. I've got a question or scenario regarding the Cameron Hills gas field and also the Fort Liard gas fields. The Cameron Hills gas field, the previous owner of the fields was the Paramount Resources. My past leadership, we've dealt with them on different issues, and they were a tough crowd to deal with. But what I did notice with that whole field, and probably no notice to any of the surrounding communities that have been involved with them, is that they sold off to a junior company, Strategic Oil and Gas. And in turn, that company didn't even operate, I would say, up there and filed for bankruptcy. That washed Paramount Resources' hands of that area when they had the money from it to pay for all the cleanup. Now we've got a bankruptcy case up there and it's going back to the GNWT probably to pay for everything. And there was no notifications to the outlying communities as Kiza, Providence, and Katodechi, Enterprise. The Fort Liard gas fields, I never hear anything about it, but I understand Paramount had gas fields in the area. Has there been any activity with Paramount Resources in terms of probably selling their stakes in the area or any other companies that presently may be there, if there's any activity in that regard? I think I'll just ask that, Masi.
Thank you. So with respect to the Fort Liard field and the wells that are in the Fort Liard area, Paramount does own a fair number of wells in that area. To the best of my knowledge, they're not selling them to anyone. However, there's no obligation on the part of companies to get the regulator's approval to sell a well. So that does mean that sometimes we hear after the fact when there is a new well operator. I can confirm that Paramount fully abandoned 2 wells in the Fort Liard area last winter season and is scheduled to abandon 4 more this winter season. So they are moving to close off those long-term suspended wells in the area.
Masi for that. We didn't touch upon the Cameron Hills fiasco or whether there was any consultations with the communities. But I'll give you a chance to answer those ones, those questions, Masi.
Sure. So the sale of Cameron Hills from Paramount to Strategic actually took place before devolution. So I am not extremely familiar with what kind of community consultation or other activities were carried out with respect to that sale. I am aware that Strategic produced a newsletter. I think it was a quarterly newsletter that was sent out to the surrounding communities. And I believe that they did notify the communities in that letter that they were shutting in production at the field. But again, that would have been several years ago now. That would have been in 2015, 2016.
Merci, Mr. Young. Further to that, you were saying there was lots of activity in the yard and even the Cameron Hills. I'm just wondering if there was any security deposit by these companies for possible reclamation and cleanup, and whether you're stating there's some that have been closed. Is there any intention to do any cleanup there? And also, haven't heard some of what you said, that companies don't need to comply to your regulations. Maybe we need to include in regulations for more company reporting to Orogo or somebody else, to the NWT government anyways, of everything, when they're closing down and the plans and stuff, even for selling to another company, that G&W should be aware, because you're going to be on the hook in the end anyway. So, Masi.
Thank you. So I'm going to take that a little bit at a time. With respect to the notification to the regulator, I should clarify that absolutely companies need to inform us if they are changing their operations. So if a company that's producing is going to shut in those wells and suspend production out of that site, they do need to notify us. And similarly, of course, if they're going from suspension to abandonment, they also need to let us know, because they need approvals for these different stages of the life cycle of the well. They do not need our approval for a sale. So that's the really the core of what I was talking about earlier, is that they can sell a well from one person to another without notifying us. However, they cannot sell a pipeline without notifying and without actually getting the regulator's approval. So if they're going to sell a gathering system like the one at Cameron Hills, or infrastructure attached to the gathering system, like the batteries at Cameron Hills, then that does require the regulator's approval. It's just the sale of wells that does not. So that was that first part. With respect to the questions about securities, I can tell you that Orogo holds proof of financial responsibility for operations authorizations that we've issued. Harkening back to some questions earlier, proof of financial responsibility is only used in very specific situations, and it's not intended for overall site reclamation. The security that's held for overall site reclamation would be tied to the land use permit and the water license that's issued by the Mackenzie Valley Land and Water Board.
I must see for that, Mr. Young. Yeah, you mentioned the pipeline too. I think we always forget to mention the pipeline that's set up on the Cameron Hills going to Bistro Lake. Is there any concerns or inspections on that pipeline, Masi?
So that pipeline, because it's a transboundary pipeline between the Northwest Territories and Alberta, it's actually regulated by the Canada Energy Regulator. So I can't comment on the state of the pipeline.
Must see, Mr. Young, it seems like we're going to have to update a lot of regulations and legislation so that people do report to our government, since we're liable for a lot of the mishaps or reclamation in the NWT. With that, we're sort of pressed for time here, and we don't see any more further questions from the committee. I'll invite you to probably have the last comment at this meeting here. Masi.
Thank you. Just want to thank you very much for the opportunity to come and to speak with you and answer your questions, and remind you that our door is open and that you're more than welcome to contact us, either come by our office in the Northwest Tower or send us an email. We're always happy to answer people's questions.
Masi, Mr. Young, Thank you very much for appearing before our committee today. And committee, is there a motion to go in camera? I need a mover, Ms. Knockleby. Motion is in order. All those in favor? Okay. The motion is passed. We will now go in camera. We will disconnect the live stream and take a 5-minute break. Masi.